Let's rock, baby.
In an attempt to change the popular series Resident Evil formula into something new, Shinji Mikami appointed game director Hideki Kamiya to take the Resident Evil series into a new direction with Resident Evil 4. Kamiya did have experience with the Resident Evil series as he worked on Resident Evil 1 and directed Resident Evil 2, which at the time was the best in the series, but if you ask me, Kamiya directed that game just because it was his job, and while he may have enjoyed making it, it didn't seem like a game Kamiya wanted to make. So when given the opportunity to make something completely new for the series, Kamiya took this as an opportunity to make a game that he'd see himself playing, something that leans 100% towards action and 0% towards survival horror. Obviously, it was a little bit too different from the series for Mikami to accept it to the RE series, but Mikami did see potential for this style of game to have an audience, so he pulled the smart play, and instead of telling Kamiya to tone down the action and tone up the horror, instead he told them to do the complete opposite. Don't look at it as an RE game, and instead look at it as its own thing, and that one decision gave us Devil May Cry. I'm sure you've heard something like that story in the past, and in all fairness, the story has gone from a neat fact you might not know to a fact that everyone knows and chooses to believe it's still an unknown fact. Kamiya as a kid had put a lot of time into arcade games as that was popular back in the day. Arcade games were made to be stupid hard as that's how they were making money. If you die, you need to get a credit, and each credit costs 1 or 2 quarters depending on the game, and everyone wanted to get as far as possible so they'd pay more money. But Kamiya didn't have much money to play games at arcades, so each coin was precious to him. He didn't want any to go to waste, so instead of immediately starting to play, he would watch other people play games and formulate potential strategies to die the least amount of times. With this and enough practice, you can eventually start doing 1 credit clears, and with games this difficult, that's bound to generate a crowd to watch you play, which can feel awesome on its own, and Kamiya would say that with crowds like that, you'd often feel the urge to show off and impress your audience even more and do things out of the ordinary. Cool. Stylish, one might say, and all of this translated to Kamiya's design philosophy for Devil May Cry. Its point is to urge that feeling of being cool, and that's why, in my opinion, Kamiya holds this game a lot closer to his heart than Resident Evil 2 ever would. Devil May Cry by design is meant to have the player be absolute dog shit when they first play, and while that may come across as a bad design philosophy, games should be easy to learn, hard to master, so that those who play the game for the first time can still come across as decent throughout their playthroughs, but that only applies to games which are only supposed to play through once. Devil May Cry, however, is designed to be played over and over again, and with every playthrough you get better and better, and by the time you do another full playthrough, you'll understand the mechanics well enough to do a full playthrough where you can show off a bit. I did have the critique when I first played through this game that I didn't think that it was fair, that I couldn't understand how to do things from the start because I wanted to do cool things, but I couldn't figure out all the mechanics, and it's frustrating, I'll admit, but after completing another playthrough of the game to make this video, I will say that I don't think that's a bad way to do things. The alternative is to have the game show up as pop-up screens in the middle of combat saying how to do things, but that's just annoying if you ask me. I want to play the game, not read an instruction manual. One thing that Kamiya didn't have to do while deciding how his love child was going to be was to make Dante the way that he is, but if it weren't for the decision to make Dante a silly goober, then I don't think Devil May Cry would get the right praise that we give it for what it does. I'm not saying Dante carries the game, in fact, I wouldn't even say that Dante is the reason the game is successful in the first place, but Dante is the character on the cover. He is the marketing material, and especially when there's a new IP, you can't market the game with familiar characters like a reoccurring IP does. That brings a challenge when you're trying to design a character that would be the poster boy for your new game. You have to create something new that captivates a new audience, and that's difficult because you can't make the same character with a different coat of paint as past games, as that would make the consumers disappointed in the characters, as people like to see something new, and that's where the challenge comes in. You won't know what the audience wants to see, you have to go off of what you think that they want to see. And thank Christ Kamiya knew what we wanted, because I can't imagine a better protagonist for Devil May Cry. Dante doesn't take anything seriously, he's just a funny guy. I think the scene right before the Griffin 3 fight is the best showcase of Dante's character.
Are you the human, the son of Sparta who challenges the darkness for this?
Block off, featherface, or you can stick around and find out the hard way.
If Dante died at the end of Devil May Cry, he would have just done it to kill a bunch more demons just to say that he could. In fact, if he died anywhere in the game, he would have just used that as a way to get to Mundus and kill him and then deal with the fact that he's dead in hell later. Dante is a cool and funny little careless goofball, and that's great, but that means that it's really hard to sell the character as someone who can be serious, someone who can have emotional connections, because seeing the guy who just told a giant-ass bird sent from the king of hell to kill him to flock off Featherface, but then after killing him talk like this.
His heinous ways make me sick, killing even his own, like they were nothing. He's the one that took the life of my mother, my brother, and Shirley. My mother used to always tell me that my father was a man who fought for the people. He had courage and a righteous heart. In the name of my father, I will kill Mundus.
It can be a little off-putting. Dante and his serious moments are just really cheesy, and don't get me wrong, cheesy moments in games are awesome when done intentionally, but I don't think that they were intending these moments to be cheesy. The best comparison is, funnily enough, Resident Evil 4. Leon's entire character is just not taken seriously, and the game knows that, hence the fact that all of his one-liners and insults are just things that middle schoolers would say.
Where's everyone going? Bingo?
But with Devil May Cry, Dante's character is meant to not take anything seriously, but when the character himself starts taking things seriously, it just throws everything off. And because of that, the most infamous line that is adored by fans of this game:
I should have been the one to fill your dark soul with light!
isn't adored for the fact that it's a very powerful scene, but for the fact that it is funny to hell to watch every single time. Dante does have the potential to be the best Capcom protagonist, and Devil May Cry is very much showing that, but you can tell that since it was the first game that all the writers did not know what the fans wanted to see more of, so leaving it as this was a very smart choice. All they really need to do is expand on Dante's silly side in the sequel. The one thing that Kamiya needed right is the combat. The thing is that combat in games is easy to make on a surface level, but to make it feel like how you want it to feel is just a little bit of a different question. The entire point of Devil May Cry's combat is to be stylish, and there's actually many components to making this work well. For starters, the combat has to be fast and movement focused. If you aren't moving a lot while fighting in a game like this, and you're still winning, then the combat won't exactly be stylish. The second part is that you have to be using all your tools at your disposal. In Devil May Cry, there isn't a moment where you're being stylish by only using one attack. And finally, there's the visuals, funny enough. Matthew Matosis has a good way of saying this, so I'll just let him explain what I mean.
Even so, despite the vast number of bullets you can fire in a single playthrough, each shot still somehow feels powerful and satisfying in its own right. The way they accomplish that is just with good use of effects, and I don't think there's any better way of explaining it than just breaking it down. Every shot from Ebony or Ivory will trigger the following: a powerful sound effect for both the shot and its impact, which is probably the most important part, but also a flash of light around Dante, an explosion sprite at the end of the gun, a recoil animation on Dante's hand, a rumble on the controller, a hit reaction from the enemy. In this case, Griffin's head will twitch, his health bar will shake, as well as blood and feathers appearing at the point of impact. And last but not least, a shell casing will fly outwards from the gun, impact with the environment correctly, and make a sound effect every time it bounces off a surface. Again, just to stress this, every single one of those effects happens for every single gunshot, which is why they feel so satisfying.
There's an argument that Devil May Cry as a series has the best combat in all of the medium, and it's a claim that I partially agree with, but with Devil May Cry 1, the biggest flaw in the combat system really comes into play. The lock-on system in Devil May Cry leaves much to be desired. Devil May Cry's lock-on system is heavily reliant on context sensitivity, which is a term that will be brought up again later in the video. Too often while fighting enemies do I want to lock on to a different enemy, but the game soft locks to one that I don't want anything to do with. The reason behind this is because the game can't tell what you want to lock onto an attack based on entirely on where your stick is aiming. In other words, the game tries to pretend it knows what you want and goes based off of that assumption. Take this moment from Mission 1. I knock down the green marionette, and instead of continuing to attack him, I want to shift my focus to the purple marionette to keep my combo going and to get higher in the styrometer meter. So I aim the stick in the direction of the purple marionette, expecting the game to soft lock me to him and not target to the green marionette. In fact, it doesn't even cross my mind that I'm going to stay soft locked to the green one, because look at the other factors that are in my favor. First, as mentioned, I am already aiming at the purple marionette with the control stick, and it's quite obvious that the purple one is a closer target. So when I start attacking it again, it takes me completely off guard and I start swinging towards the wrong one, requiring me to improvise. To support the game, improvising isn't a bad thing, but if it's the game's inconsistencies that require you to improvise and not your own mistakes, the issues come up even more. The issues come up even more when I'm trying to use the stinger as a simple way to move a little bit faster to the next area, then the game instead soft locks to an enemy nowhere near me, and now now I'm swinging backwards. An easy fix would just be to have a dedicated lock-on button, so the player has a lot more control over their own attacks instead of letting the game decide who they're fighting based on a rough guess on what's around. That being said, the combat is still pretty good. There's a wide variety of usable moves for Dante that make the game, well, more stylish. Some of them obviously don't do much in terms of combo. Air hike is just a double jump, which is useful, don't get me wrong, but I find myself using it for more than just moving around and less for combat. But the rest of the moves in the game offer other ways to be more stylish, which is probably a good thing, seeing as Devil May Cry's entire goal is to make you feel cool and want to show off to basically yourself, but it's probably one of the safer ways to pleasure yourself anyways, so I see this as a win. Alistair is definitely the more fun melee weapon of choice here, as Ifrit is just full of slow attacks that, while provide their own fun, and Ifrit is technically the stronger weapon, it's very much a sacrifice of speed in place of damage, but it can still do some pretty cool stuff with it. On this playthrough specifically though, I generally focused more on Alistair and pretty much only used him for the boss fights, which are the rare exception if any. That being said, there's obviously going to be benefits to using Ifrit over Alistair, such as the Nightmare fight. There's this whole idea out there that Nightmare is really hard with Alistair and is much easier with Ifrit, but I never saw that when I was absolutely demolishing Nightmare with Alistair, just kidding. It's very obvious that since Nightmare isn't the most movement heavy boss, he's designed around the idea of do damage and do a lot of it or it's going to be a very rough time. While we're on the topic of Nightmare, I might as well just start talking about the bosses. And since I'm already talking about Nightmare, I might as well just talk about him. Generally, Nightmare is a pretty good boss. I like the idea if you want to do a good chunk of damage to Nightmare himself, you can do an optional refight of bosses you already killed. I think that implies something like they're Dante's biggest fears or something, but that doesn't make any sense when he's the only shown compassion for one boss in the entire game. Nightmare isn't anything special, but his gimmick isn't something I'm upset about. All it really is just some running back and forth on attacking Nightmare, hitting the ring thingy, avoiding his attacks, and repeat. There's just one problem: the soft locking system. It's not as big of a problem here as it is in just the game itself, but that doesn't change the fact that it's really fucking annoying when the game's preventing you from doing what is needed to kill the boss just because it doesn't know what the player wants to do. The other problem I have with Nightmare is Nightmare 3. I wanted to hold off this point for as long as possible, but I guess that just can't be avoided for any longer. Devil May Cry's single biggest flaw is the camera system. The classic Resident Evil games had a fixed camera system, mainly because the backgrounds are pre-rendered, so if there were any use of any other angle, it just wouldn't work. But to the game's credit, the camera system added a bit of a horror feeling to it because you wouldn't know what's around the next corner. It also helps that classic RE use the tank control method, which means that no matter where the camera is, holding forward will keep whatever character you're playing as moving forward in the same direction. Although I'm not the biggest fan of the classic RE game's control style, I much prefer a more modern third-person shooter style like the RE remakes. I'll give the game's credit in saying that all those mechanics play into each other into something that works very well for what it is. So here's the list of how the classic RE games benefit from the fixed camera angles. Devil May Cry has none of those. All of the environments are 100% 3D. Devil May Cry is definitely not a horror game, and it doesn't have tank controls. It has analog controls. There's no good reason for the system to be in place, especially with analog controls. The game tries to accommodate for that by having it so if you hold the same direction when the camera transitions, then Dante will stay moving in the same direction. But the issue is obviously that it doesn't work very well. That's why if at any point you notice a snapping of Dante's movement then immediately turning around, that's just me realigning my joystick to be in the direction I want to go. The game still tries to accommodate for this during boss fights by fading out things that are in the way of your vision, but it's just bizarre to me that they don't just make the camera system better for the type of game that it is. And Nightmare 3 is the biggest showcase of the game's camera system just feeling like a slap in the nuts, because now when I'm trying to hit the weak point, but first I need to avoid Nightmare's attacks, which I just can't see what's attacking me. I've gotten familiar enough with the game that I won't be dying as much due to these dumb things that are out of my control, but for first timers this fight can just be flat out frustrating and not the Dark Souls kind. There's a difference between a game being unforgiving and a game being unfair to newcomers, but to the game's credit, it is unforgiving in a good way in many cases. In fact, there's more good than bad. I promise that I like the game. The first boss fight, Phantom, for a first timer can be incredibly difficult, and although I'm making it look like a cakewalk, that's only because I have a few playthroughs under my belt, but on my first playthrough I died once or twice fighting this silly little spider. I do enjoy that you encounter Phantom in the game. Aside from the required fights, you can actually kill him in the times where he's just chasing you down the hallway. Obviously I chose not to, but it's an option for the people who really want to show off, so it's here for a reason. Phantom is probably where most casual playthroughs will come to an end because the game is really challenging, and because the game doesn't just give you a win button by spamming your guns, you're forced to get up and close and personal with him. Phantom is definitely a tutorial boss, telling you how you should expect future bosses and even enemy fights to play out, with most of his attacks requiring you to move around to avoid them and not attack him, and showing that you can't stay too close to enemies the whole time to attack them because there's an attack that just stabs you if you just stay on top of him to do the easy damage. Phantom is definitely my favorite boss fight to fight, specifically Phantom 3, not just because he's a fun boss to slice like a sushi chef, but because Phantom 3 has a unique way to dispatch him. You can kill him in the traditional way, but there's another way to kill him that's kind of like a puzzle. Devil May Cry has basically no puzzles. The most puzzle the game has is key items that are just key clones, which is basically just leftovers from when it was supposed to be a Resident Evil game. But Phantom 3 has a puzzle to it so that you can only really figure it out on repeat playthroughs. When you stand behind Phantom where he can't see you for long enough, he'll try jumping on you, and when he lands on the glass beneath you, the glass kinda starts to break. One may notice this on a first playthrough, but might not think much of it. But if you just decide to keep on doing it just to fuck with Phantom, then after a few jumps, the glass just flat out breaks on him, and it leaves the same cutscene as if you killed him the traditional way, which may imply that this is the canonical way Dante killed Phantom, but obviously if you don't want to kill him this way, the rating system will still let you get an S rank at the end of the mission. Generally, I don't really care about rating systems in video games because I always found games much less enjoyable if I try to constantly grind out a single part of the game just to get a better letter saying I did a good job, and it doesn't really change anything here, but that being said, it does feel nice getting an S rank at the end of a mission, and it does have its benefits in the game, like giving you more red orbs, which allows you to buy more moves and items and whatnot. I'll touch on items later. Griffin is hands down the boss that is the most different to take on. While the rest of the bosses are very much able to be fought in multiple ways with any weapon of your choice in any way, but Griffin is very much more use your guns to kill him. There's a very small arsenal of guns in this game, and while they all serve their purpose, I very much enjoy using ebony and ivory the most, and in turn I generally will ignore the optimal weapons for dealing with enemies. For example, the optimal way to take out Sin Scissors is a shotgun, but I'd much rather kill them with Alistair, not do the tedious opening of the pause menu to switch to the shotgun to take out 1 or 2 Sin Scissors in the room, then reopen the pause menu just to re-equip ebony and ivory. This is a genuine problem, and while it would be nice if there was a button on the controller that hotkey at least one other weapon of choice, but that didn't seem all too necessary for this because the game clearly wants you to use melee weapons more anyways, which is why there's a button dedicated to switching between Alistair and Ifrit. The issue with ebony and ivory that I have is that if you want to rapid fire, which trust me you do, you have to press the fire button each and every time you shoot a single bullet, which can cause intense hand and wrist pain if done for a prolonged amount of time, and on Dante Must Die difficulties where bosses have much more health, so this can genuinely cause hand injury. Funny enough, playing through this game on my first playthrough, at the start I actually mildly sprained my hand and had to call it quits on manual rapid fire and switch to using turbo. Call me a cheater, but I genuinely don't know why they don't just have a rapid fire for this weapon when that wouldn't take too much to code in and would probably be a better experience for many people. So using turbo, it turns Griffin from a miserable boss fight to an actual good fight. I have gotten better with the rapid fire without turbo, but it's still definitely an issue. With turbo on, Griffin is a good fight where you have to avoid red lightning attacks that he shoots at you, and for Griffin 1 it's the only way you can build up your style meter. Fun fact, you get the Ifrit gauntlets right before the Griffin 1 fight, and the only way you can leave the boss room is to light the torch by the door with the Ifrit gauntlets. So that means that even on your first playthrough you can just skip the Griffin 1 fight, but I doubt most people even know that you can skip it on your first playthrough unless some backseat gamer is suckling your toes to help you get through a playthrough. But that being said, it's definitely a lame way to get through it because there's a whole cutscene showing Griffin off and Dante says one of his cool one-liners preparing for a fight, but then skipping it just feels like you're ending a fight before it's even really started. Griffin 2 is easily the worst boss arena in the entire game as it takes place on a small ship with not much movement opportunities. You can lure him to land and use your melee weapon, but my pea-sized brain can't figure it out for the life of me, and I'm too lazy to remember what all the guides say. The game can be really bad with boss arenas. Sometimes they're alright, they can even be pretty good, but you can very much tell that these arenas were originally just supposed to be set-piece rooms like Resident Evil and not actual boss arenas. Either that, or the people designing these rooms were actually told to make boss arenas and they just really suck at their jobs. The worst one is very much Griffin 2, but the Phantom 1 arena is also kinda bad, with all the pillars in the way, which is just much of an issue for the player as it is for Phantom. Phantom just keeps getting stuck behind pillars. It doesn't happen too often, chances are you won't even have it happen to you on a first playthrough, but with a game that's meant to be replayed, it's bound to happen at least once. Another pretty bad offender is Nero Angelo. I guess I should talk about Nero Angelo a bit before I continue the ramble. If the name Nero Angelo sounds off off to you and you recall it as Nello Angelo, that's completely fair, as the game refers to him as Nello Angelo. I don't really feel like explaining it myself, so I'll pull from Matthew Matosis' Devil May Cry commentary again to explain why this is, as he explains it the best out of anybody.
This boss is listed as Nello Angelo in-game, but I'll be calling him Nero Angelo because that's what it was supposed to be. In Italian, that means Black Angel. It's in Italian because of the Divine Comedy, where Dante and Virgil both get their names from. I'm not sure how much of an influence the Divine Comedy was in general, given that the game started out as a Resident Evil title. I read through it looking for connections, and nothing really stood out to me except for the naming of Dante and Virgil, which is obviously intentional. Nero Angelo would have been mistranslated as Nello Angelo because of the way L's and R's work in Japanese. There isn't actually an L sound in the Japanese language, they just have an R sound, but they don't pronounce it quite as harshly as English speakers would. So when they take a word from another language into Japanese, the L's get turned into R's. If you were to get your hands on the documents for Devil May Cry and Nero Angelo was written in katakana, it would read as Nero Angelo instead. Consequently, when a translator sees a foreign word in Japanese, they need to ascertain whether the R's really are supposed to be R's or whether they should be replaced with L's. In this case, they guessed that both of them should be L's, so Nero Angelo becomes Nello Angelo. He's an important character and it's a good name for him, so it's a shame they got it wrong.
If you want some more Devil May Cry content after this, then check out that commentary. It genuinely has some interesting things about the game's development, design, and all that jazz, so I just highly recommend giving it a watch. If you couldn't tell, a lot of what I know about this game's development and whatnot is from Matthew Matosis' commentary. But regardless, I generally like Nero Angelo as a boss fight. All three of them are pretty good, and Nero 1 is a decent fight with a decent enough arena for what it is. There's platforming, but it's the least offensive platforming can get in this game. I'll get more into that in a minute, just add that to the checklist of things to talk about in this video. Nero 2 is just worse. The arena, while kinda open, just also too condensed, with too many things getting in the way of actually fighting Nero. Nero 3 also has this issue, it's just much less extreme, and is definitely the best Nero fight, which makes for a good finale for him, with him requiring you to use every single skill you've accumulated, and is probably the hardest conventional fight in the game. It's one of the few times in the game where I still get my ass absolutely whooped. It's not unfair, it makes you use both your sword and guns, but it's also really easy to cheese with Devil Trigger. And it ends off with a cutscene revealing that Nero Angelo is Virgil, Dante's twin brother.
Virgil, it's Dante. Happy birthday. Wow! I want chocolate! No, I want chocolate!
And that's all we get to learn about that for now. I mentioned Devil Trigger, which is the biggest and single-handedly the most vital mechanic in the entire game. Pretty much every unlockable ability in the game is only usable with Devil Trigger, so while you might want that really cool Vortex ability, you might not even be able to use it when you unlock it, requiring you to buy purple orbs to increase your Devil Trigger meter. Devil Trigger makes you do more damage, and while it isn't an automatic win button, it does make you look really fucking cool. Your Devil Trigger meter can only fill up with 4 ways: dealing damage, taking damage, vital stars, and taunting. Doing damage is already what you'll find yourself doing for the entire game. You don't want to take damage, obviously, even if you get more powerful attacks from it. Devil Trigger is vital to the player if you want it as much as possible, obviously without dying, which may be why the item Vital Star is called what it is, which refills your entire Devil Trigger gauge. And finally, taunting. Taunting is a risk versus reward mechanic. You are completely vulnerable doing a taunt. It only lasts for around a second, but the only way to get out of the animation is to take damage, and that 1 second is all it takes for an enemy to deal damage to you. But if you're able to pull off a taunt, you get an entire icon filled up, which usually what it takes to fill up one, so there's always that feeling that you can pull it off, and if you do it, it will be worth it. As I mentioned before, Devil Trigger is how a good portion of abilities work, and having and knowing how and when to use those provides a huge advantage. Not all of these are going to make the game easier, they're a tool, and not all of them are going to work for every situation. Viable abilities were invented in Devil May Cry, and they definitely didn't stop after Devil May Cry, but the abilities in question makes the game really stand out. The other items besides Vital Stars are really just mostly upgrades. Stuff like health upgrades, Devil Trigger upgrades, Okay, only 2. The absolute best items are the holy waters and untouchables. You can have as many holy waters as you want, and using them wipes out every enemy within range and does a good chunk of damage to bosses. Personally, I only use them as a last resort, and using them too much might make the game boring, but having a few of these on you is essential. Untouchables are flat out the best item in the game. They make you completely immune to all damage, and the devs knew that they were overpowered as you can only hold one of them at a time. There is a bit of an exploit though. If you buy one of them from the shops, then pick up the one that's kinda hiding somewhere in the game, then you'll have 2 in your inventory. Save these for bosses that you know you'll struggle with, and even then use it wisely because they don't last for long, and if you die mid-mission and use a yellow orb to revive yourself, then you won't get those items back. There's no real downside to having items other than your rank going lower by using them, but if you're anything like me, the rankings really don't matter as much, as I discussed earlier. Mundus is the final boss in the game, and he's 50% good and 50% trivial. The first half of the fight has a weird shmup mechanic where you have to destroy the shield in order to do damage to him in the first place, then shoot the hell out of him after. It has absolutely no relation to the general gameplay of Devil May Cry. The game has multiple sections that are, I want to do something different with my game, but I already explained it as much as I could with the base mechanics, and they're really not that great. There's the aforementioned Moodness fight first half, then there's also a water section that puts your perspective into first person, uses tank controls to move, essentially ruining the pacing that the game initially had. Each playthrough will have at most around 5 minutes of water time unless you're going for 100% completion, but it sticks out like a sore thumb as the rest of the game isn't like this, and it also just is not that great. At least in the Moondus shmup section, you can use Devil Trigger to get over with the fight faster. The second half to the Moondus fight puts Dante back in his general control scheme, and the intended way to fight him is so you can jump onto the platforms and whack him with your melee a few times, shoot him, and avoid his attacks. There's this weird lava dragon that pops up a few times in the fight, which is really just meant for giving the player a heal in case they take damage. You can shoot at Moondus or hit these stone orbs to build up Devil Trigger and deal more damage to Moondus, but to be quite honest, I don't want to do any of that. Instead, we'll just use an untouchable or 2, activate Devil Trigger, use some vital stars, jump in the lava water thing, and take out Moondus in a much faster way. I love that the game allows you to do stuff like this, and while the style meter might not say it looks cool, this looks cool as hell, which is funny because we're currently in hell. Too bad hell has a fair share of platforming, and that's just god-awful in this game. The problem with platforming in Devil May Cry is that it's one of those games that just locks you onto whatever the game thinks is where you want to go, but it isn't the most accurate. Sometimes it will lessen your normal jump distance because it thinks it's closer than it actually is. The platforming section right before getting the Ifrit gauntlets is the biggest offender here. I fell way too many times, missing very much possible jumps. If Dante can do long jumps like this, then there's absolutely nothing that should stop him from making smaller jumps like this. If you haven't noticed yet, I'm playing Devil May Cry through the HD collection. The PlayStation 3 had a trend of making HD remaster collections for many classic series on the PS2, and Devil May Cry got the same treatment. The HD collection is nothing short of awesome. You get Devil May Cry 1 and 3 in the same collection, all games featured are in HD and widescreen, it comes with concept art for stuff in the game. Devil May Cry through the HD collection does beg the question if it's really contributing to the game's preservation. After all, the original release on PS2 wasn't in widescreen or in HD, and that's a fair point, but the issue with preserving games is that in 20 years, more and more hardware will start to fail, and we won't be able to play this game through the original PS2. Some might say that emulation is the answer, but emulation is still incredibly new in the grand scheme of things, and emulators, while incredible pieces of software, aren't at the point where it can be one-to-one with the original console. Personally, I use emulators all the time, but I'm not gonna lie and say that they're without their flaws. And making Devil May Cry more and more accessible to people through this HD collection is the better way to go. In the future, what are people more likely to play? The original game with PS2 graphics, which while yes are beautiful in their own right, but not to most people, or would people rather play an HD enhancement of the original? I personally am not playing the HD collection on PS3 or Xbox 360. I'm playing through the re-release on PC through Steam, which got a release in 2018. There's no actual difference between any of the versions other than playing through PC allows me to use Turbo so I can play video games for more than 5 years of my life. It's how I first played the game, and I do believe it is the best way to play the game. The HD collection isn't without its flaws though. Some cutscenes were hard baked into Devil May Cry so they look like they're from the PS2, and it looks off when other cutscenes weren't hard baked so they could make them HD. The pause menu is still in the same aspect ratio as the PS2 as those were baked into the game, but honestly you won't really notice it, and personally I can't imagine this game with widescreen pause menus. Another great thing with the PC version specifically I might want to mention is that you can customize your controls through the Steam controller input, which wasn't possible in the original. This entire video really makes it seem seem like I don't like Devil May Cry 1, but that's far from the truth. It has its flaws, but no game is perfect. It really does stand out from the rest, and if you are a fan of action hack and slash genre, then this is a must play without a doubt. Devil May Cry really does so much right. Some of the flaws in the game may seem like it failed at its goal of making the player feel stylish, but that is far, far from the truth.
The sky, so clear, so blue.
It looks like we have a winner.
Jackpot.